that looks good. All right.
Oh boy. Did you know that 80% of all tweets come from just 10% of the user base? Did you know that 55% of social media users are worn out by politics? And did you know that only 18% of social media users like seeing politics in their newsfeed? 70% of people say it's stressful to talk about politics. After engaging with someone in politics, 72% of people say that they had less in common with that person than they had previously thought. Another way to frame this is to consider that only 13% of all tweets are political, and yet 97% of those tweets come from the most active 10% of all users. The vast majority of political content on Twitter comes from a very small minority of users. And the scary thing is that of those fringe users, 55% of them self-identify as either being very liberal or very conservative. That's a lot of numbers, but the takeaway is just that it's a very small percentage of people that make up the majority of the political landscape on social media, and they self-identify as being on the fringe of the political spectrum. Another interesting one is that 45% of people find you annoying when you make political posts. That's why I do it. So most of these numbers were derived from data pulled from Twitter, and that's mostly just because it's a lot easier to gather data from Twitter because of how Twitter's set up, but other studies have been done that have found similar results on Facebook and other platforms. Facebook is a little bit more tame than Twitter, but a lot of the same principles still apply. And I'll leave links to all the studies down below. So it makes sense why the majority of our political discussions are dominated by just a select few. Most people would just rather not engage with the political sphere too much, especially with people that they strongly disagree. Most people will, for the most part, just avoid the political discussions. They'll do a lot to avoid conflict, and that's fair, that makes a lot of sense, but it can have some negative effects, and that's what I'm gonna focus on. If the majority of people don't engage in much political discourse and they sort of leave that discussion to the fringe, given enough time, some negative things can start to come about. And to sort of set up what we're going to talk about, I'm going to try and give a really simple illustration. So if we break up the population into just two major buckets, where each bucket, one or the other, is mostly familiar with the internal workings of that same bucket, and I know that this is an oversimplification, but we can imagine that for a person belonging in, say, the liberal bucket, that the liberal bucket is mostly familiar to them. It is at least much more familiar to them than it would be to someone in the conservative bucket. So we've got two buckets, each representing conservatives and liberals. Now the viewers in each bucket can see the other bucket. So the people inhabiting the conservative bucket can look and see the liberal bucket and vice versa. But they can't see the whole bucket all the way through. They just see the top bit of the bucket, just the upper layer that is visible from the outside of the bucket. They only see the bits of the population that choose to present themselves. And that's the important part. They only see the parts of the population that choose to present themselves. The parts that surface up to the top. That top visible layer in each bucket represents the fringe minority of people who engage publicly in political discourse. It's a special kind of person that shares their thoughts openly on Facebook, or will just attack people or get into debates online, or bring up politics at the dinner table, or bring up some really heavy discussion at Christmas, or make really cringy YouTube videos like this one. And this next bit is something that we all kind of know, I think, but maybe it's not something that we've completely admitted to ourselves, which is that character traits often come in bundles, and there's a lot of literature on this. People who very strongly take on one attribute are likely to take on other certain attributes as well. We can gather bits and pieces about what a person's mental state might look like just by knowing the kinds of things that they do. Think about the people that you know that are most politically outspoken, the most rambunctious, the loudest, and then think about the commonalities between them. You can probably identify at least a few common traits. Politics aside, they might be what many would consider to be toxic people. They probably show signs of being aware or just not caring that their positions exist on the fringe. The worst of them, the ones we often roll our eyes at, are those that are likely to engage in what we might call shitposting. Or maybe they just lack the ability to engage with someone that they disagree with in a polite and delicate way. These people are often the most brazen, annoying, forward, unaware people. And this is just a very loose generality. And for all of these reasons, this is why we find ourselves in a place where we are annoyed by politics on Facebook and Twitter and other platforms. There isn't anything inherently wrong with being politically controversial. There's not even anything wrong with being confident in that. But here's the catch. The type of person who has the attribute set that is required to be publicly controversial is by nature very likely to have other attributes that are undesirable. And I want to be really careful to parse this out correctly. There obviously isn't anything wrong with being controversial, with debating, with arguing, with being disagreeable. If you know me at all, you know that I myself am one of those people. But the truth is that for a number of reasons, we find that character traits or attributes come together in bundles. So for example, let's say that you're someone who posts about politics on a daily basis. well, the chances go up dramatically that you're also someone who doesn't care a lot about what other people think about you. Or alternatively, you might just be entirely unaware of how you are being perceived by others. Whatever the case, there's something about your psyche, there's something in there that's putting in you the positive drive to go post something out there or say something out there at the dinner table that doesn't exist in other people, or there's something that you're lacking that other people have that would otherwise suppress that urge. Now, the point in all of this is just to say that we have to calibrate ourselves against this fact. We have to calibrate our perception of the others against this fact. We have to understand that when you look at the bucket of others, we aren't getting an accurate picture of what the makeup of that bucket is. In fact, we're getting the worst possible image of that bucket, or an image that represents just a fringe minority of people in that bucket. Then we start to see the others as being, at the very least, potentially more like ourselves than we knew, and maybe at best, someone who we might actually identify with quite a bit. The other bucket becomes more approachable. It seems less extreme. And eventually, we even begin to realize that there's actually a difference between the people that make up the majority of that bucket and the fringe top that we are exposed to. It helps you to have a certain patience and humility to understand that you are being presented the worst parts of that culture, the worst parts of that half. And if this just seems all obvious to you and nothing new, well then I'd say that you actually are someone who has discovered this already, and I applaud you for that. But you might be underestimating how bad we are at doing this, because people are susceptible to the images that are presented to them. It's very hard to see through all of the noise. People are incredibly influenced by the noise. It's hard to see through that. And here's what we know. It's just a fact that right now people are at each other's throats. Our country has not been this divided for a very long time. There have been some studies that have been done that have claimed that we haven't been this divided since the Civil War. And that might be a little bit dramatic, but whatever the case, it's true that we are very divided right now. Both sides have demonized the other side. And this is needless. We don't need to be doing this. We're being divided in ways that we don't need to be. We are being given false images of the political others around us. Seeing the fringe is arguably the #1 reason we are so divided right now. And I mean, really, this is pretty sad, because if everyone actually had a clear understanding of the political landscape and where everyone falls across that landscape, it would go a long way for unity, for healing our culture, for changing the way that we engage in political discourse. But there is something we can do to change this. There's something you can do to change this. You can engage in changing the way we see each other. And there's two pieces to this. The first piece is what you can do internally, and the second piece is what you can actually do out there in the world externally. Internally, it looks like giving yourself constant reminders to recalibrate, constant reminders to put into context the image that you're getting. Whether it's on social media, the regular news, or your crazy uncle at the dinner table, we can all do a better job at just staving off our judgment, taking a moment to just breathe and put everything into context, and to understand that what we're seeing right now might not represent the larger whole. We can train ourselves to be more gracious and forgiving in thought, in the way we think, in the way we process, in the way that we interpret. And really, I mean, if you believe that our culture is hurting, if you believe that we're splitting apart and that we're being more and more divided every day, as I do, then you can be proactive. You can make a conscious effort to dig deeper into the buckets that you're not a part of, into that population, and try to really understand what's going on under that upper layer of hysteria. Whether this is engaging over social media or just taking advantage of a moment with a friend or family member to engage in a political discussion, there's a lot that you can do to re-engineer the way that you think about the people in the other bucket. All right, and lastly, I'm going to go as far as to say that it is your moral responsibility to contribute to the conversation. If you consider yourself to be a moral creature, someone who cares about the well-being of others, someone who understands that a person's well-being is in many ways a function of their environment, and that environments are sculpted by people, then it follows that you must partake in the sculpting of that environment. If our cultural fabric is disintegrating, and if you can be a part of preventing that, and you don't, then what a waste. What an uncaring move. Because here's the obvious truth. The thing that makes it so crystal clear why you need to start speaking is that when you don't, when all of the people in the middle don't, when the majority goes silent, then the only thing that others will hear will be the noise coming from the most radical of us, making it that much harder for us to remain as one whole. So to wrap it up, 1, be gracious with how you perceive. And 2, speak up. Don't let the extreme ends define the conversation.